Hey everyone, I'm Emily. I'm a product designer on the fulfillment, billing, and subscription management team. Today I wanted to talk about the recent UI copy audits that we did around some of the fulfillment workflows, and specifically the ones that I was involved in were around the fulfillment renewal flows. So I thought it was sort of an interesting process, and I wanted to talk about a little how we went about it, and some of our major learnings throughout the process. So how this sort of came about is that fulfillment flows are not necessarily all in one UI. They're not necessarily linear. They go lots of places. So some of it might be in the UI in GitLab.com. It might be in customers. Certain things might be in the docs. Things are in email. Things are in instance. There are a lot of different sort of disparate places that we have messaging, and that we communicate to our customers even within like one single flow. And something that we've known for a while is there are a lot of areas where things are outdated and customers get confused. So Jackie had sort of opened this issue about, auditing copy throughout each of these sort of major workflows. So specifically, the ones I'm going to talk about today are the renewal flows. So sort of how we started this was we sort of broke down these flows, and each took on different ones to get them scheduled. So we split them amongst the teams. One of our very first learnings was that in getting these scheduled, even though we were breaking them amongst the teams, among different developers, designers, PMs, we only have one tech writer for the section. So our initial scheduling was a little bit ambitious, let's say, for one person to accomplish all within, a milestone or a couple of milestones. So we ended up having to space them out a little more than we expected because of that sort of constraint. So basically, the idea was that we would look at a single flow, in this case, self-managed legacy license renewals. We'd set up some time synchronously to sit down with the product designer, tech writer, and engineer, actually go through the flow, look at all of the different pieces, look at all of the messaging, evaluate the docs, evaluate the UI, evaluate the emails, and then sort of make MRs and make changes right there. So the first thing that we learned as we scheduled our first meeting was, as the meeting was coming up, we're like, wait, maybe we need to prepare for this a little bit more. So Fiona had this great idea. She came up with this spreadsheet where we'd have the sort of area. If any of you have gone through, excuse me, if any of you have gone through the quality demo process for different features, this is a pretty similar spreadsheet to that, where you have a specific area and the steps involved. And so Fiona had sort of created this framework, and then I went in and filled out the different steps involved for a renewal. And this was fairly loose. This is something that we iterated on as we went through the process, but it gave us sort of a format to get started. So with that, we went into our first sync meeting. And again, as we started our sync meeting, we learned that probably we needed a little more prep ahead of time. There are certain things that were a little bit more difficult to replicate. So for example, with renewals, we had to have subscriptions that were already created and backdated such that we could actually go through the renewal process with them. So that took a little bit of time in our sync meeting to get that sort of up and running. And that's something that in future audits, we actually did ahead of time as prep ahead of the meeting. Another thing that we learned is in this first meeting, or in this first audit, the engineer that volunteered to help us was someone who was very new to the team, because the team had sort of identified it as potentially this is a great onboarding task. It's fresh eyes, someone that can come in and bring a fresh perspective. And while that part is true, the other part is that these things are very complicated to replicate. And that engineer, being new to the team, didn't have their local setup working yet. And so overall, it wasn't a very good onboarding task because there were certain things that were like we were trying to replicate. We were trying to replicate alerts that happen at certain times, and there was just sort of a gap of like, oh, we're not necessarily able to do this right now. So that was overall one of our learnings. Potentially not the best onboarding task. It works a little bit better if you have someone that's a little more familiar with how to replicate these things already. The other thing that we learned is that it's really hard to test anything with a third-party integration, which we already knew, but there are lots of things around emails that happen from Zora, and we don't necessarily have access to production Zora, even within the fulfillment engineers. That's another team that owns the Zora configuration. So there were certain things that were very hard to replicate during that sync meeting. But what we did do is we went through as many areas as we could, and we took notes about like what areas the copy could be improved, what areas the copy was inaccurate, and then we started making MRs to update these things. One of our big learnings here was that it is much easier to point out areas where the copy could be improved, but in terms of actually writing better copy in a sync meeting, that's very difficult, and that's actually a task that we took async. Initially, I think the idea was that we'd like, all sit down and write copy together, but writing is one of those things that it's really hard to do, like, right there on the spot. So that was one of our learnings, is that really writing is better done async. And then we were able to, collaborate on that copy. Like in this instance, like Fiona created the MR, and then, I would go through, or the engineer would go through and propose some different changes. We'd have conversations, go back and forth until we got to copy that we could all agree on. So that was a really successful piece of this, is sort of the collaboration around that. With our second one, for SaaS renewals, we had a much better system down. We'd already gone through and created the different steps. Going into that second sync meeting, the engineer had already set up subscriptions that were ready to renew. So we saved a lot of time during that sync meeting, and we were able to get right into actually auditing the copy. The other thing that we really came out of this with is that there were a lot of areas that we found that were just inconsistent or not completely correct with what they say in other places. So I think part of our MVC culture is, the smallest possible change. And sometimes the smallest possible change means you're not necessarily thinking about the bigger picture, or, places that like a single word might be used in other flows. And so looking at it really holistically like this, with the idea of making it a lot clearer from end to end, is something that I think was incredibly valuable, because it gave us that opportunity to be like, oh, like it says active users in customers dot, but in instance, it says billable users. And that was a change that was made several milestones ago. And so, I mean, that was sort of a tricky thing, because obviously like instance version upgrades don't happen overnight. So I think that's originally why the team had decided to keep active users for the time being, for more people to get on the version that use the term billable users. But I don't think there was ever like a, let's go back and make sure that's updated at some point in customers dot. So that was something that we were able to update to billable users, or, things like active or billable users for self-managed versus seats for SaaS. Some of the different wording that we use more consistently in other areas. So yeah, we ended up creating a lot of different MRs for each one, and then closed out the issues. And I think this is something that I found really useful. I think we're talking about doing this potentially maybe once a year, to really go through these flows and make sure that all the docs, all the UI copy, all the emails are sort of in the same place and communicating the same message. So with that, that's all I had to share. If there are any questions.
I don't have a question. I just want to say this is something that I think is really inspiring, and it's something that I would love to tackle, like a similar initiative for Package. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your process.
Yeah, definitely. I thought this was, when Jackie brought it up, it was, I thought, a really great idea, and something that I personally found a lot of value in. And honestly, it wasn't really that much work. We set up an hour for a sync meeting. There was some pre-work and then some post-work. But overall, this was a really lightweight thing. And I think it ended up creating a lot of consistency that we didn't have before.
For the areas where you weren't able to replicate or get something working in the sync session, were you able to go back and kind of figure those out later?
Yeah, we did. So one area that we had trouble replicating during the sync sessions were like alerts coming up to the renewal. So that's something that the engineers went back and replicated for us and took screenshots of. So we collaborated on async. A more difficult one was emails that are sent from Zora. It's the NApps team that owns like our Zora configuration. So they are sort of the owners of Zora. So even for like fulfillment engineers, it's not something that they sort of directly have access to, but we were able to get screenshots of those emails and read through them and make sure that if there were any copy updates that, we created issues to get that copy updated as well.
For the alerts, I'm curious, like we have a lot of alerts in GitLab. So how did you even know that the alerts were there and that you needed to replicate them?
That's a great question. I knew because I've worked on them in the past. That's a great point though. You don't know what you don't know, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most difficult parts of fulfillment is that we work on a lot of time-based problems. So like even this renewal process was sort of like a travel through time from like, we had to create a backdated subscription and see alerts that happened coming up to a renewal and then actually going through the renewal, and, getting the emails after the renewal. And, time is one of those things that in development is really hard to replicate in a realistic way. So I think that's definitely a larger challenge.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge we have at GitLab with like the amount of specifically alerts comes to mind because like we have alerts from different teams that can be introduced during different flows. And I've thought a lot about it in terms of like, all right, how do we know where all these alerts are coming from and when they get triggered? So yeah, I was wondering if you had any ideas there, but I know in Foundations, we're working on a pajamas adoption scanner where it'll show like all of the different types of alerts, for example. So maybe that's one way that could help us, but maybe we could talk to our engineering counterparts of like, how can we have a better system for understanding what alerts are shown when and when are they conflicting or when are there 3 versus like 5 or whatever. So yeah, something I would love to dive more into, but it's great that you had a good understanding of the alerts in your area so you could take a look at those.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely really relate to all the alert problems you just mentioned. So yeah, I would love any improvements in that area. That's been an area of difficulty for us as well.
Any other questions anyone has? Feel free to verbalize. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Emily. It's really great seeing you work through the entire flow and create that consistency. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks everyone.